The Chinese see themselves increasingly as a mediator, and so it'll be interesting to see if they go beyond, as Cobus mentioned, the oil and try to bring some kind of stability, if not a resolution, to what's going on in Niger and Benin.
When the price of cobalt is going low, it means that the batteries are also cheap. When you have cheaper EV batteries, you're going to have cheaper EV cars available into the market. But since the US has put the geopolitical element on it, you add the IRA element into it, it means that all those cheap EV cars that can really be driven within the United States are just not going to get in the United States. And you're like, guys, you cannot say that you want to fight, climate change, you want green transition to happen, you want US consumers to encourage them to buy, EV cars, and at the same time having the kind of behavior and narrative that prevents those EV cars just because there is a China element into it. You say, no, you're not welcome in our US market. So what are you doing?
Even though AI has been very involved in parts of the ongoing crisis in Gaza, we are still babes in the woods, in relation to its full power. But we're already seeing the impacts of the kind of erosion of the very concept of truth. Just simply because of human acts, right? So that's already challenging enough. So this is going to be very interesting, I think.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by my two favorite colleagues. Actually, I like all of our colleagues, but right now, you guys are my two favorite colleagues. Geraud, who is our Africa editor, joining us on the line from beautiful Mauritius, and Cobus van Staden, our managing editor, on the line from Johannesburg, South Africa. Very good afternoon to both of you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, it's fun for us to think back a few years ago when we used to do a China-Africa newsletter every single day that people used to complain about was filled with too much information. They used to say, guys, I love what you do, but it's just too long. There's too much going on. Do you remember those days? I mean, there was so much happening. And then over the past couple of years, boy, that just really dried up. There wasn't anywhere near as many announcements about deals. Remember, COVID was huge for the China-Africa engagement in terms of vaccines and masks and aid and assistance and all that. But over the past year and a half, there hasn't been a lot going on, and it's been tough for us to even find stories. We'll look every day for our subscribers to look for what's happening, and some days, literally, there is nothing. That was not this week. This week, it was like a blast from the past, from the old days. So we're doing a week in review show here where we're going to try and cover a lot of ground. We're going to talk about the Niger-Benin pipeline drama that unfolded this week. We're also going to talk about some interesting debt refinancing and Angola. Lots of activity in the EV battery metal space. The US, China, Africa saga, that flared up again this week. And then I hope you guys will stay until the very end and listen to some of the new analysis that's coming out of ChatGPT 4.0. We're going to play you what ChatGPT's new service, their new audio service, their voice-activated service, what they have to say about China, Africa, and debt trap diplomacy. And I want to get the guys' impression of what ChatGPT sounds like. Okay, let's start in Benin. And it was a very interesting week. This is one of these stories that with all that's going on right now in the world, the war in the Middle East, where Putin is in Beijing this week. This is a story that I think got overlooked by almost everybody, but there is a spat going on between Niger and Benin in the Sahel in West Africa. Now, normally that wouldn't capture our attention, but this has a very important China angle because just a few months ago, they completed a 1,900-kilometer pipeline going from the landlocked Nigerian oil fields all the way out to the Atlantic coast ports in Benin. And this was supposed to be a cash cow for both Benin and Niger. And they were going to use the money generated from the oil that is passing through this to repay somewhere about $4 billion that it cost to build it. And I think Niger has $400 million of loans. And this was a showcase project for the China National Petroleum Corporation, CNPC. Very interesting is that after the coup in Niger, the pipeline wasn't finished yet. And the Chinese went to the new junta government and said, are we good? Can we keep doing this? And they went, do you have any problem with us? And the Chinese said, no, good, finish the pipeline. They finished the pipeline last year, and this week it was supposed to turn on and oil will start to flow. But Geraud, oil didn't flow until this week. And so it was blocked and then it was unblocked. Now, it became unblocked in a very interesting turn of events. And this is something that I would like to get your take on, Geraud, is that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and CNPC sent a delegation to Benin to talk to the president. And we don't know what was said. We don't know what deals were done. They have not resolved their differences between Niger and Benin, but yet suddenly the oil is flowing. Tell us what happened, Geraud.
So basically, from what has been reported from Africa Intelligence, who was reporting the story, it said that there is a delegation of Chinese foreign affairs and diplomats and members of the public officials from the Ministry of Energy and High Representative of the CNPC that arrived in Cotonou, Benin, in May 14th. They met the Patrice Talon, which was Benin president, on May 15th, and they spoke. Apparently, after they spoke, the Patrice Talon agreed to release some of the oil so the oil can be charged on the supertanker that arrived at the port at Semé in Cotonou so it can go. So this is basically what came after that meeting. But as you say, what happened, we don't know much about what happened, what they said, what they told them, what they convinced him to do, but he agreed on doing that. We also have to remember that few months back when the coup in Niger happened, that Patrice Talon went to Beijing, and it's been widely reported that Beijing kind of not pressed him but convinced him not to implement the sanction against Niger because China had interest on that pipeline and he wanted the border to remain open. So I'm not really surprised at the role that China is playing in this situation between Benin and Niger.
Can you just give us a very quick summary of what the dispute is about between these two countries?
So the dispute is about the fact that Niger has decided to close the border with Benin on its side, saying that there is French military base in Benin and those French military base can be used to destabilize the security situation in Niger. Niger, feeling it's being unsafe, being in danger, decided to close its border, believing that in those bases, French is training some Islamist group that are coming into Niger to create instability. That's the reason why Niger started to close the border. And on its side, the consequence of that decision, it makes that Benin agriculture that's supposed to send the product to Niger cannot do that anymore. So they're quite impacted. It's been lasting 2 weeks now. It's been impacted by that decision. So Patrice Talon said that if you believe that we're partners, if you're a partner country, you cannot behave that way. So since you believe that we might be like a hostile country to you, we also decide to stop any oil flowing from Niger to Benin to be shipped to the supertanker and sent to China. So that's basically the situation they're finding themselves right now, and the standoff between the two countries. That's why China had to intervene to find a peace between the two countries. But the dispute is being resolved, not sure, because the moment we are talking, the border is still closed on the Niger side, but oil is flowing on the Benin side.
So, Cobus, this is really interesting. When I saw that the Chinese somehow managed to negotiate their interests would be taken care of, not necessarily a peace between Benin and Niger, but the fact that now oil is beginning to flow, and that was their primary concern. It just made me think of like, wow, these guys are ballers. Because in this part of the world, in the Sahel right now, is one of the most difficult, most volatile regions anywhere in the world. And the fact is that the Chinese have come through all of these various coups, Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea, and yet their interests have remained largely intact. Whereas the Americans now have been ejected out of Niger. We know the French are just, sucking wind all throughout the region, justifiably so after what they've done over the years. But the Chinese seem to be doing quite well in many of these very difficult regions. And the point that I made today to our subscribers in my note was it's showing that their diplomacy is quite adaptable to these very, very contentious environments.
It does seem like that. They certainly seem to be able to navigate very choppy waters. Just from a very outside perspective, it also seems to me that part of that success is because they have such a kind of relatively narrow thing that they're focusing on, So because it's only the oil and not the wider problems or the wider region or peace and security or democracy or whatever, kind of that makes it much easier to negotiate, I assume.
And that's the same in Guinea as well, where it's iron
yes,
ore. And, yeah.
So, I mean, it's all very interesting. It does make me wonder, though, whether China will have any kind of broader impact in the region, kind of because I think part of their approach seems to be to really want to avoid any kind of broader impact and to avoid any broader, kind of engagement rather than this specifically oil and specifically this pipeline and specifically just solving this problem. The rest of it seems to be they're kind of agnostic about, and I was wondering how it affects kind of broader Chinese interests in, kind of in the Sahel, because they're also obviously involved in iron ore and other, kind of regional countries there and other kind of involvement, kind of in the region. So I was wondering whether this advances their broader involvement at all. Geraud, what do you think?
That's what I was telling Eric earlier when we were talking about this with this subject. I say this case reveals something really interesting, that China can really become, quote unquote, a peace broker in certain cases. We've seen that they've been attempting to do something similar in the Horn of Africa, which being appointed special envoy, but so far over there, they haven't been really successful. But in this case here, we see the pipeline being this cross-border investment. It's a massive investment, $4.6 billion. And CNPC is exploiting the oil on the Agadem field up north in Niger. So just because of that, we kind of understand that China has interest that the two countries remain in peace. So because of that, China has leverage on both Niger and Benin to really being able to tell them to put them on the table and to find a peace situation between the two of them. But how is going to be played beyond the two countries, that still remains to be seen, because except Benin and Niger, we don't see a lot of cross-border investment. We might see something similar happening later on if China decides finally finance the eco project in between Uganda and Tanzania. But definitely in this case here, we see that China now can become a factor of stability just because of its investment to make sure that everything goes smooth between the two countries. And it has now that leverage economically. It has that leverage on both two countries, allowing them to be able to, to broker peace.
Geraud, you're not alone in wondering if that's something that the Chinese can do. On the German public news service Deutsche Welle, on their website, they ran a story on Wednesday, "Can China resolve Niger-Benin border dispute?" Wondering if, again, as Cobus mentioned, the new priority for Beijing to be a broker of sorts around the world. And let's not forget, of course, that they brought Fatah and Hamas to Beijing. They have done the Horn of Africa. They did the Saudi-Iran deal. So I think the Chinese see themselves increasingly as a mediator. And so it'll be interesting to see if they go beyond, as Cobus mentioned, the oil and try to bring some kind of stability, if not a resolution, to what's going on in Niger and Benin.
But Eric, allow me to throw you a curveball, and even to Cobus as well, in the sense of, like, we're talking about peace and stability here. We know that China has that non-interference policy in its foreign policy, but when you see that investment, you can't help but wonder if China will not, in a certain way, now paying closer attention to the ones who's taking power in either Benin or Niger. Because when you have that massive investment, are you just going to sit idle and wait for an anti-China person to take power? Are you going to make now sure that there's no anti-China person taking power in either Benin or Niger?
Yeah, but there aren't any anti-China leaders in Africa today.
Yeah, that's true. But let's see if that can happen, how Beijing would react, knowing that its investment is in danger in that region.
Well, we will keep an eye on this story. I have a feeling there's going to be more to this story with the Chinese coming up in the weeks ahead. So we'll keep an eye on that. Guys, since I said there was so much going on, I'm going to do a little bit of a lightning round here. I'm going to bring everybody up to date on 4 big stories. I want you to pay attention to this and pick one of them to comment on and to give your thoughts of. Let's start over in the Horn of Africa. Geraud, as you talked about, Ethiopia and Djibouti took ownership now of the Ethiopia-Djibouti Railway. This was launched in 2018. It's a 759-kilometer rail line that goes from Ethiopia all the way to the port of Djibouti. It costs about $4 billion. And this week, the China Railway Group and China Civil Engineering Construction Corporation handed over operations. This is normal. This is part of the build, operate, transfer model. A lot of times this happens in the 6th or 7th year. And so now it's up to the Djiboutians and the Ethiopians to run this railway on their own. That's a pretty important milestone that we saw this week. Also down in Kenya, staying on the east coast there, the Kenyan government says it's aiming to double Chinese investment in the country to $1.6 billion this year. Investment Cabinet Secretary Rebecca Miano is confident that this will happen based on a growing number of deals that are happening right now so far this year in the agro-processing, healthcare, and cold storage sectors. By the way, they just had a China-Africa Economic Expo event in Nairobi, and there was a lot of excitement there as well. I think Kenya Airlines is going to be expanding some of their routes to China that came out of that event as well. Staying in finance, Angola is using an unusual method to pay down its debts, according to the Financial Times. Finance Minister Vera Davies de Sousa, she told the FT that Luanda is actually going to use money from an escrow account to repay a loan for the China Development Bank, or to the China Development Bank. Now, for those of you who've been following the debt story, you'll know that that is highly, highly unusual. They have these massive escrow accounts that are used not to service debts, but to repay them in the event that a country or a borrower defaults. And so in this case, Angola is not defaulting, but they are drawing from the escrow account to meet some of their debt servicing costs. And finally, guys, and this is, I want to get your take on this, Geraud, because it's really interesting. In the EV and the battery metal space, two very big deals were announced. Lots of deal activity. First, Nigerian President Bola Tinubu announced plans for a new $200 million Chinese solar panel manufacturing facility and Nigeria's largest lithium processing plant. Now, we had heard about this deal earlier, but the fact that the president christened it made it important this week. Also, two Chinese EV battery component companies signed deals in Tangier, Morocco, to build plants there worth $900 million, $450 million each. They are going to build battery components that will be put into EVs that get shipped to Europe. Cobus, let's go to you. Which of those four stories stood out to you and what caught your attention?
You know, they're all very interesting. The one I particularly focused on was the Nigerian one. Like, you know, an actual solar manufacturing plant being set up in Africa is huge. It's huge. This is really an interesting movement. In the first place, also the lithium refiner that's also, you know, announced in Nigeria, similarly very interesting movement. You know, kind of we've seen that happening in Zimbabwe. Even as the UK and the EU, as you know, as part of their new kind of working arrangement with Zambia and the DRC, they keep paying lip service to this idea of building some kind of like refining, manufacturing batteries, something in these countries. Meanwhile, China is doing it, like they're building it. And the fact that it's now that solar manufacturing is going to happen in Nigeria, like I cannot overstate how big this is. Like this is really.
Well, you're just getting excited about this because you're a South African suffering through ESCOM, and any source of solar panels is a good one, right?
I mean, if there's one country that still has an even more messed up electricity situation than South Africa, it's Nigeria. You know, and so the fact that the solar equation is now not only about importing Chinese-made solar panels, but it's actually making solar panels with the Chinese in Africa, while the West can barely get it together to make their own solar panels. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, and
it's probably going to be solar panel assembly, is my guess. They're going to bring the components over from China and they assemble them.
Yes, I assume they're not rolling out the quartz glass, you know, kind of like as we like hundreds of episodes ago, we had like mind-bending interview with quality control people working in the solar industry, and like what it takes to make an actual solar panel is off the charts nuts. But it's interesting. I think even assembly, I think it's a huge step forward. And it shows you also, you know, kind of that this kind of South-South cooperation is to a certain extent making, like, all of this is happening against the background of the 100% tariff on Chinese EVs imposed by the Biden administration, and a lot of talk coming out of the US and EU about possible tariffs on Chinese solar panels as well. It really exposes the kind of North-South split in these conversations, you know, kind of around climate technologies particularly, and I think it just is an indicator of how there's no displacing China from that position in the global south. Like anyone who wants to do anything solar in the global south is going to do it with China, not with anyone else, I think.
Geraud, which of those 4 stories stood out to you?
There is the Morocco story where you see Chinese EV companies investing in Morocco, which
Yeah, this is something you've been following very closely.
Yes, I've been following that very closely, and it really makes sense to the context that we've been talking about it, how China is now using third-party countries to gain access to Europe market, and Europe to the US market as well. So Morocco has been winning all over the place, having BYD, still BYD being present, although it's also canceled one of its project in Morocco. But yet you have companies like Haliang, like the one that's mentioned in this story, being present in Morocco. You have so many of them now doing joint venture with different South Asian country like South Korea investing in Morocco as well. So Morocco is really taking advantage of that position, and I'm sure that people in Brussels and London and Washington are really paying close attention, and they kind of know that China is playing their rules against them by finding a third-party country who has a free trade agreement to really remain accessible, to have that access to the European market. But the other story that really caught my attention is the case of Angola, though. We know that it's not really common to use the escrow account for reimbursement, that, for those, they only use that when country default and then everything. But when you see Angola doing that, we know that João Lourenço went into China last time, and he required that, finding a certain, maneuverability in his debt repayment, so they can have much more time to deal with those kind of issues. Though Angola did not default on his loan to China, but seeing Angola using the escrow account to pay this debt, I kind of wonder, is it a prelude? Is it not a sign that maybe something might be going wrong, or maybe something might be, I don't know, I'm just speculating here, but maybe something might be might be happening? Because I was really kind of baffled when I saw that. I was like, why are they using the escrow account to pay the debt to service debt, while they still have income revenue coming from the old revenue? But why they're using that account, it's quite, for me, it was quite suspicious for me.
Well, there could be a lot of reasons behind it.
I mean, I was also wondering whether that means, are they now going to have to replenish the escrow account after using it too? Because that was what A-Data was showing, right? Kind of like, is that these escrow accounts having to be replenished all the time as well?
Or it's just like, I don't know, maybe in the case of Angola, that escrow account had a provision of like, you can also maybe using it to service that, we don't know. But seeing Angola using that kind of caught my attention. It's like, why are they doing that? What's happening? Do we have to worry of something happening? And I've thought of Cobus, because Cobus wrote about that few months back, saying that how Angola is the proof that debt trap narrative is just so fake, that you still have countries with huge amount of debt that still can service their debt normally to China without having that situation.
But this is the frustration in the China-Africa loan or lending relationship, is that we don't have the transparency. No one's talking. The fact that we got an interview from the Angolan finance minister in the FT is much more than we normally get. And so at least we got some of that information. But boy, the Chinese would benefit, and both in Angolans as well, by being more transparent. And maybe, I think to your point, Geraud, that investors may also be looking at this and going, what? So that transparency will help them on their bond prices. It'll help them with their currency. It'll help them with their investor confidence that everything is potentially okay or not. So, but that is interesting. What it shows to me, and again, I think everybody needs to remember that when we talk about Chinese lending in Africa, Angola is by far the exception here. Angola accounts for about 1/3 of all Chinese loans. And to Cobus's point, this is really important, that they're showing some flexibility in how to manage some of these debt servicing issues. And so I think in that respect, that is really very notable. And again, the reasons may be dire. That's why they're doing this. We just don't know yet. But I urge there's only this FT article. We'll put a link to the FT article in the show notes. Keep an eye on that one, because there may be more when you lift up that rock, as Geraud pointed out there. Let's move on. And Geraud, we're going to come right back to you, because this is a story you and I were laughing about all week here. So, the United States likes to talk up a big game about how it wants to move into the critical mineral mining space in Africa. And that was particularly topical this week, because at the Rose Garden, U.S. President Joe Biden, as was referenced earlier, announced massive new tariffs on critical minerals, on batteries, on cars as well, coming from China. Now, the challenging thing here is that by making it more expensive for American consumers to get batteries, minerals, and electric vehicles from China, which we don't get EVs right now, but in the future they may come, the United States doesn't really have an alternative to produce this on its own. But at the same time, it's struggling to get American and Western mining companies to go into places like the Democratic Republic of Congo to start mining for cobalt. Now, Jose Fernandez, and we've referenced him a number of times on this show, he's the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, and he's basically the top U.S. diplomat on these critical mineral issues. He said on Monday at a conference in New York sponsored by the Cobalt Institute, which is an industry group, and let me read you this quote, and it makes me think, Geraud, that it's entirely possible that Jose Fernandez is reading the China Global South Project columns here and listening to the show. But here's what he said. He said, what we're seeing now, I feel, is a variation of predatory pricing. In the case of cobalt, there's a company called CMOC, which is driving this oversupply, and that's keeping prices down. There are consequences when you have oversupply, he said. It's a challenge to our clean energy goals, which are going to require exponentially more cobalt going forward. The problem is that when the price of cobalt is down, and we're talking right now, Geraud, they're about at 2019 levels. I mean, the price of cobalt now is down 5 or 6 years low, is what I remember. That makes it difficult for American mining companies to say, you know what? I'm going to make money if I go to somewhere like the DRC and start mining for cobalt. So these American mining companies are sitting on the sidelines. Now, let me give 2 data points that explain and justify what Undersecretary Fernandez was saying. In the first quarter of 2024, bear in mind, we are at 5 or 6 year lows on cobalt prices. CMOC's cobalt output surged 392%. In 2023, all of last year, the company's cobalt output jumped 174% compared to the same period in 2022. So you and I, Geraud, have been wondering, why is CMOC producing so much cobalt rather than keeping some off the market, as Glencore tried to do, by the way? Remember that? Glencore tried to keep cobalt off the market in an effort to push the price up. And it makes no economic sense whatsoever that CMOC is doing this. And that's what Fernandez was referencing. What was your take on his quote?
Let me just add up another number in terms of data points. Last year in 2023, as you mentioned, CMOC produced 526,000 tons of cobalt. Only the first quarter of 2024, they produced 25,000 tons of cobalt. That just tells you that this is the first quarter of 2024. So by the end of 2024, we're going to have much more cobalt that CMOC is going to produce, and which kind of tells us that CMOC is not in the mind of reducing or decelerating his production of cobalt. He's going to keep on increasing his production of cobalt, which really should worry many people, many stakeholders like mining companies, those new mining companies who wanted to come into the industry, that become really much more worried about the price of cobalt going down. And this comment from Jose Hernandez kind of, for me, it highlighted, I'd say, the powerlessness of the U.S. administration to deal with the situation. I think it came to grasp that we really can do much about that. You remember last year in December 2023, there was a bipartisan commission in the U.S. Congress that said we should put in place a mechanism that allows the U.S. to protect U.S. industry from price fluctuation of cobalt on the international market. And we are now May 2024. Jose Hernandez come to realize that, guys, we have no control over the price. Chinese can drive the price down so low that they can just make it impossible for any new player to come into the business, allowing themselves to keep on stockpiling the cobalt reserve because they're going to buy it so cheap, and on the other hand, just blocking any new player to come into that business. It's very interesting, and it also really, as I was saying, highlighting not only the US, but the whole G7 and all the Western country inability basically to challenge China, because as long as you don't control the market, as long as you have no ability to control the fluctuation on the market, what you're telling to your private sector is telling them that you're going to be seeking and finding new money, easy money. And for the current actors in the cobalt industry, they're going to listen to them. They're going to look at you and say, guys, you are telling us a free China supply chain, but obviously you don't give us the tool to do that. Just let us do what we do best, doing business with Chinese companies. And this is what's going to happen, unfortunately.
Now, here's another little interesting fact that in Cobus, I'll get to in a quick second. that I saw this fascinating chart this week, Geraud, that showed that the quantity of cobalt that's being used by Chinese auto manufacturers has declined sharply because they have now shifted increasingly towards LFP, to lithium phosphate batteries, which don't use any nickel or cobalt. And the Chinese have been stockpiling cobalt in their strategic reserves, but the domestic use of cobalt is going down. But yet, when you look at US and European cars and what powers those EVs are NCM batteries, nickel, cobalt, manganese. So it gives you this point that this is a point of leverage that the Chinese are building over the West. And so why is, CMOC doing this? Now, CMOC ostensibly is a private company, if I recall. It doesn't necessarily take direction from the central government. Who knows why they're doing this? What we know is what they're doing makes no economic sense. The strategic value of having a critical mineral surplus that you can leverage over your rivals makes a lot of sense. Now, we're reading into those tea leaves. Cobus, what's your takeaway on all this?
Well, yes. I mean, this is all actually questions that I'd like to ask Geraud. But I was asking the same thing. On the one hand, can we really kind of see it as just simply a way of, it's a kind of a tactic to absorb, kind of like low prices for a long time in order to keep competitors out? And what's the kind of end game there? Like, how long can they do that? And then the second place, are we actually seeing with the low cobalt prices, a bloom of cobalt battery production, which we're not really sure of, right? So I wonder if you could talk about those two things. What do you think, how do you think CMOC ends this game, in the future?
I think here I'm going to be referring to one of the articles, a really interesting coverage that Bloomberg did a few weeks back about that, where Bloomberg, quoting some stakeholders in China, mentioned the fact there was a meeting last June where Chinese government met with the captains of industry in China, talking about how they're going to stockpile nickel and cobalt as well. So I wouldn't be surprised that among those companies, the big companies, you would find CMOC, because CMOC is the largest cobalt producer in the world right now. So obviously they are part of a larger strategy that combine both, I think, the industry and the geopolitics in the same time. But how long can they play the game? I think they can still play the game for long. In the case of CMOC, for instance, CMOC is only last year has put online is Kinsanfu mine. Kinsanfu mine is arguably the largest cobalt reserve in the world. So basically, CMOC hasn't touched yet his largest cobalt reserve it is on his portfolio. So basically, it can still drag the game long enough, a year, I don't know, but just long enough to remove the idea or just to discourage any banking or financing services to try to finance Western cobalt project, because it's just going not to be sustainable. And the higher CMOC is going to keep on producing, that's just going to make situation much worse and much more difficult. Eric said that we don't see much of the use of NMC batteries in China. It went down. But let's not forget that cobalt is also used for storage of high power capacity that China uses a lot in its different industry, defense industry, military industry, and everything. So I do believe that China drove the charge against NMC, because let's not forget, China is the one that really drove the R&D research on a non-cobalt solution, while being the one controlling the cobalt production. That was really something that we mentioned before, but we didn't really pay attention to that. They drove all solution, non-cobalt solution, and today they're doing that, but yet they're controlling the cobalt, I believe, for other solutions, for other applications, but also I believe that it's really, as we mentioned earlier, for geopolitical purpose, because when they look at the market, NMC is widely used in the US, in Europe, in many EV industry, they use a lot of NMC. So when you have that in mind, you kind of understand it's going to be much more difficult for many Western countries to switch, because beside production, they also have the whole infrastructure of EV batteries to put in place and everything that needs to be addressed for many Western countries.
Don't forget that CMOC has some very deep pockets, so it might be able to take this for quite some time. China's CATL, and many people may not be familiar with CATL, but it is the largest EV battery manufacturer in the world. They own about 25% of CMOC, and they're doing increasingly joint development in places like Bolivia, where CATL and CMOC are going in together to mine lithium, for example. And this isn't only happening in the cobalt space. It's also happening in the nickel sector as well, where Chinese production remains very, very high, despite nickel prices being low. So I think Fernandez could have also mentioned the nickel space as well. But it speaks to a broader point about the U.S. really not having a strategy. And that's just not us saying this, by the way, even though we have been saying this for a long time. But auditors at the U.S. Exim Bank announced this week, after an IG report, that's an Inspector General report, that evaluated the bank's activity from 2014 to 2023. Okay, so not even just in the past year. And here's what they concluded: that they lack a growth strategy in Africa. Okay, and that shouldn't come as a huge surprise, because the United States has lacked a strategy for Africa for a long time. But again, this came out this week. Last week, we saw an internal report in the European Commission that the EU's Global Gateway funding has been spread too thinly and must be concentrated if it stands a chance against Beijing. So that's, again, according to an internal review. And then when we look at PGI, which is the Partnership for Infrastructure and Investment, which is the answer from Washington to the Belt and Road Initiative, we're seeing some movement in places like the Lobito Corridor. We talked about in a previous show about what the Development Finance Corporation is doing, but it's not a strategy. There's lots of little tactics here, lots of little initiatives here, but I think what's missing is this overarching strategy that, again, what the auditors at the Exim Bank are saying. They're saying what we've known for a long time, that it doesn't look like the Americans and the Europeans are really mobilizing to take on the China challenge in places like Africa, but not only in Africa, but elsewhere around the world as well.
Yes, I mean, they're facing a lot of kind of internal issues, of course, in terms of just mobilizing the resources, getting the political will behind the mobilization, getting the companies to play ball, and so on. But I think, one of the issues, and I think the cobalt thing really kind of shows that, is that even though the kind of Western governments complain about China weakening the kind of international system or the international liberal order, and complain about, at the same time, about, for example, state subsidies in the EV sector and so on. Like Henry Luce was pointing out, in FT, that in theory they obviously have the tools to deal with all of these issues in the form of the World Trade Organization, but the successive U.S. administrations weakened the World Trade Organization to such an extent that now it can't be used really in these disputes anymore. So one does have a feeling that for all of the kind of complaints about kind of China weakening global systems, so much of that, kind of happened within Western, within the kind of like center of Western power. And now, as they need to kind of pivot to a new set of realities, they just frequently don't have really the tools to really kind of deploy on the ground in any kind of fast way. Like they face a series of institutional reforms that they have to do, even as they already need those institutions to be renewed and working already. So I guess the old West and the new West are kind of like, confronting each other, I think, in this crisis.
But Eric, look at how, for me, when I think of that in that situation of cobalt, look at how the United States is itself slowing down the green transition happening in the US market. When the price of cobalt is going low, it means that the batteries are also cheap. When we know how much the battery costs in EV cars, it means that when you have cheaper EV batteries, you have cheaper EV batteries, you're going to have cheaper EV cars available into the market. Those cars that can be used in the US and everything. But since the US has put the geopolitical element on it, you add the IRA elements into it, it means that all those cheap EV cars that can really be driven within the United States are just not going to get in the United States. And you're like, guys, you cannot say that you want to fight, climate change, you want green transition to happen, you want US consumers to keep on using, to encourage them to buy, EV cars, and at the same time having the kind of behavior and narrative that prevents those EV cars, even though they might be Chinese, they might be Americans, just because there is a China element into it, you say, no, you're not welcome in our US market. So what are you doing?
I know, but listen, politics is powerful, though.
Yeah, it really gives one a glimpse of how the debate is so shaped around elite concerns. And it's so kind of indifferent to the concerns of actual poor Americans, I think.
I don't know if that's fair, Cobus. No. I don't think that's fair. A lot of this is to protect the working class and what's left of it in the United States that manufactures cars and manufactures car parts and the whole ecosystem of automotive. We see what happened to our textile industry. You saw what happened to so many industries that were gutted by moving these products offshore. I mean, that's the working class that makes those cars.
Yes, I understand. But there's one thing that the US, I think, when I look at the US economy, hasn't really successfully done is like transitioning the economy to become a fully service economy like the UK has done it or other European countries have done it, in a sense of like the US still want to have both an economic service economy and also to be an industrial power in the world.
Yeah.
Which in the game they created of international market and, searching for the cheaper cost and everything, they created a system where when you follow that logic, the US cannot be an industrial country anymore. It should be the country of service and everything.
You guys are both cutting us short here. The United States is highly automated in its manufacturing and is a major manufacturing powerhouse in the world. We still manufacture a lot of stuff, believe it or not. I mean, it doesn't seem like it, but when you look at the statistics, we do crank out a lot.
Yes, that's true. But the international economic system today has made that, you search for the cheaper cost of labor. You search for the one that's increase your revenue. And unfortunately, that's not in the US anymore for many US consumers.
It's also happening against the background of a massive like climate polycrisis, right? I think this is one of the interesting really interesting splits in the conversation between the global north and global south at the moment, because from the perspective of the global north, Chinese state subsidies that boosted from their perspective overproduction, right, of electric vehicles and solar panels is framed almost 100% as a problem, right? Of course, they have strong domestic economies to protect, and of course that's why it's a problem. But from the global south, particularly from the
it's great if Chinese government and taxpayers want to subsidize cars for us, bring it on.
Well, particularly on the solar thing, is like that subsidy, I think, is going to, in the slightly longer term, going to be framing China as a massive benefactor to the entire world. I'm not particularly pushing that line, but I think that is the line that's going to come out, because, who else is making all of the solar that we need to do to try and save the humanity? No, not Europe, so.
But don't forget, guys, that within the Inflation Reduction Act are tens of billions of dollars of subsidies.
Exactly.
There's a certain irony of that the Americans not liking the Chinese subsidies, but I know I'm going to get flack from that from our folks in Washington. Let's now move on to our last segment, and this is the one that I've been looking forward to the most. Do you remember the first time that you went on the internet? I mean, saw a browser, got some information. Do you remember where you were when you first did that?
That was ages ago. I don't know.
I will never forget. 1995, I was at UC Berkeley, and I checked the Giants baseball scores, and it blew me away. Like, oh my, I just typed it in, and there it came. And it was something that we've never seen before. I will tell you that this week, I will remember where I was when I used ChatGPT 4.0's new service. When it is, I don't know if you guys saw the videos on YouTube. It is unbelievable what it can do. So this is, and I won't go through everything of it, but what I want to do is I want to play ChatGPT's answer now, and they're using audio voice, and I'm going to do this real time so you guys can hear what it does. And this is just on their app. This is on their normal app. I have the paid service here. I don't know if the free users can get it, but if you have the paid service, you hit the little headphones, and this is what will happen. And then, so I want to ask it a couple questions, and then I'd like you to evaluate its answers. Okay, you guys ready?
Ready.
Okay, let's get started here. Hey, ChatGPT, can you tell me a little bit about Chinese loans in Africa?
Chinese loans in Africa are part of China's extensive efforts to strengthen economic ties with the continent. These loans, provided mainly by Chinese state-owned banks and the government, focus on funding large infrastructure projects such as roads, railways, ports, and energy plants. The impact of these loans can be significant. They help address critical infrastructure needs, fostering economic growth and development in African countries. For instance, the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya, funded by Chinese loans, has improved transportation and trade routes within the region. However, there are concerns about debt sustainability and transparency. Critics argue that some countries might struggle with debt repayment, potentially leading to economic dependence on China. This concept, often referred to as debt trap diplomacy, suggests that China might use debt as leverage to gain control over key assets or exert political influence. While there's debate over the validity of this claim, examples like Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, though not in Africa, often come up in discussions about the potential risks. Overall, Chinese loans in Africa present both opportunities for development and challenges related to financial management and sovereignty.
So, what did you think?
I'm impressed. I'm impressed by the nuance. It's way better than it was before.
Cobus, last year when we were looking at this, one of the concerns that you brought up, which actually prompted us to make our own chatbot on our site, which is a closed network only drawing from our content, our interviews, our podcasts, and things like that, was that the narratives that were coming out of the large language models like ChatGPT were drawing on Western news sources and as a result had Western biases built into them. There you hear the debt trap narrative brought up, but it was brought up with a certain degree of nuance that we didn't see in last year's responses from ChatGPT.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I think it probably reflects to a certain extent a broadening of the discourse itself, kind of because the debt trap thing has come in for a lot more criticism, over the last year or so, but so in that sense, it is still obviously feeding off, current discussions on the internet, but it does certainly come across more nuance. Early on, the first kind of answers I read struck me as something akin to what, if you were teaching this as a course, like one of your kind of like mid-level students would write, kind of not the smartest kid in the class, but also not the one who's barely showing up. Now it's creeping closer to the to the top of the class, kind of, and it's becoming just more nuanced, more kind of measured, in lots of ways. It'll be very interesting to see how it develops from now on.
Let me ask one more question now, just to see if it picks up. And again, we want to pick up ones with strong U.S. media narratives. Hey, ChatGPT, is China going to build a new military base in Africa?
There have been reports that China is seeking to establish a new military base on Africa's Atlantic coast, specifically in Equatorial Guinea. This potential base would allow Chinese warships to rearm and refit, significantly enhancing China's naval capabilities opposite the east coast of the United States. China already has a military base in Djibouti, established in 2017, which serves strategic purposes like anti-piracy and securing trade routes. This base has evolved from a simple resupply station to a comprehensive logistics facility. The possibility of a new base in Equatorial Guinea fits into China's broader strategy of expanding its global military presence. This expansion includes investments in dual-use facilities, where commercial ports can also serve military purposes, allowing for a more extensive and flexible presence without overtly militarizing new locations. For further details, you might find articles from Chatham House and the United States Institute of Peace helpful.
Ah, that's interesting. Sourcing it, we haven't seen that in the past either. But that was definitely a very American-centered answer. And again, let's be very clear here. That narrative of the Chinese building a base in Equatorial Guinea is not supported by the available evidence or what we know in the scholarship. So that is very much driven by American media narratives. But it is a much more nuanced answer, though.
I mean, when it says there are reports, we know those reports are in the Wall Street Journal.
That's it. I mean, it's primarily Michael Phillips, who's the journalist at the Wall Street Journal, who's basically a mouthpiece for the Pentagon. There's no other way to explain what Michael Phillips, who's the correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, does, but just basically serve as a mouthpiece for the Pentagon on this issue. But Geraud, how do you see now AI and ChatGPT 4.0, and by the way, Google announced a whole new suite of tools this week as well, changing the discourse and the discussion about, say, not just China-Africa, but, coverage of what the Chinese are doing more broadly?
If it continues to engage and includes larger, broader perspective on the debates, I see that it may be helpful, and I think it may just kill reading once for all. Many people who don't like to read, I remember you keep on saying that people, they want story short. Now with ChatGPT having an audio service, people can now at least learn quite fast about, about all those issues. And for me, my biggest concern remains its nuance, the need of including as much as different perspective and voices into the debate in a way that at the end, the outcome become much more balanced. It becomes, and I love the language, there is a lot of might, may, maybe, there are reports and everything. It shows you that I'm not saying, I'm just, reporting what has been said or in different places. And which means that the more we feed the space with different perspective, the more those ChatGPT and other AI service will become much more balanced. But the less we feed the space, the less one single narrative will be dominating the space, which is going to be negative. So now it's maybe raised the question about, for example, a country like China that's closed off, that has a different kind of internet, quote unquote, a different kind of internet. As long as China remain closed like this, how much China expects to see a tool like ChatGPT starting to give nuanced perspective about what's happening in China and what China does overseas? In that answer, let's remember that ChatGPT gave answers from research and scholars that coming from other parts of the world, not China itself. So I do believe that maybe there is an opportunity there for maybe China to understand that it's maybe time to flood the space with different narrative to allow those AI to become much more balanced and skewed toward a single narrative.
Okay, let me show you one other thing. Hey, ChatGPT, can you tell me about China's relationship in Africa, but please answer in French?
Bien sûr. La relation entre la Chine et l'Afrique est complexe et multifacette.
It can do it in Chinese, in French. I mean,
it's impressive.
So we're in a new world now, guys. It's here. This is unbelievable, the power that's coming. And as Cobus, as you pointed out, it's changing very quickly now, as everybody's very excited right now about the potential positive uses. If I was, and I know we have a lot of teachers who listen to us and professors, guess what? It's going to show up in your kids' term papers a lot.
Oh, it already is. It already is. Like, I was speaking to academics a week ago, and they were saying they already are scrambling to find AI detection tools because, like, so many term papers are written by AI now. So many. It's already a huge problem.
Guys, I've been thinking, since ChatGPT is doing voice service, don't you think that the future of things like podcasts could be in danger as well?
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I mean, again, can it bring the level of nuance that we're bringing to this? And there is a human part of this but again, the pace at which this is changing is so fast. And it might also turn into a situation where we become irrelevant because people get enough of the AI-generated crappy news on TikTok and on social media that they really don't need any more from humans. I mean, that is just going to be so overwhelming. And I think we're descending into the 7th layer of hell pretty soon, when so much AI-generated misinformation and disinformation is going to populate the ecosystem that people just aren't going to know what's what. And there's nothing that can tell us that ChatGPT is going to remain pure. Right now, it was citing sources from the U.S. Institute of Peace, but this is a year or two old, this technology. Once it becomes weaponized, who knows what's going to happen to it? And that's where I think the human role plays a very important, the human role plays an important part of this whole story, that we will continue to be balanced as much as we can, but people will know where we come from. They can talk to us and we can show them our sources and whatnot. So I still think there's a role for people, but we have to evolve with it. I mean, it's changing so fast.
Well, it's also happening in the context of a human-made information crisis, right? Kind of like we're now several years deep into post the concept of fake news. Human-made disinformation is its own huge problem. So so we already crises I think we the world saw a particular kind of many examples of that kind of different kinds of misinformation emerging around the Gaza crisis, for example. And and that, even though AI has been very involved in parts of the ongoing crisis in Gaza, we are still babes in the woods, in relation to its full power. But we are already seeing the impacts of the kind of erosion of the very concept of truth, just simply because of human acts, right? So that's already challenging enough. So yeah, this is going to be very interesting, I think.
But again, this is why we are doing what we are doing. And this is the mission for what we're doing at CGSP, is to have people like Geraud, like Cobus, Antonia, who's our Jakarta correspondent, Johnny's in Jerusalem, I'm here in Saigon. And we're trying to be the antidote to disinformation. And we are so grateful to the thousands of people in governments, in corporations, in activists, in universities around the world who read us every day. But I'm not going to lie to you. You know, we are like every other media company in the world where our backs are against the wall, that people are consuming less news. They're not willing to pay for news. And at the end of the day, if you, all of us, don't support independent, nonpartisan journalism, it goes away. And on China now, we're seeing the China space shrink farther and farther and farther. We didn't talk about this, but last year was the China Project. That disappeared. This year, China Dialogue is no more. China Dialogue became Dialogue Earth. Axios axed its China newsletter. There's not much, believe it or not, that's out there in this space. And there's certainly nothing like what Geraud is doing in French. Geraud, I mean, there's nothing in French that does this, and in Arabic either. And so what little there is in English is much less in French and in Arabic. So we're asking for your help, straight up, if we're going to survive. And we've got a new donate button on our homepage, and we would love your support. We'd be very grateful. If you'd like to join our Patreon community, we have a few benefits there that we offer. We do briefings. We also produce a weekly newsletter for our Patreon subscribers and supporters. And then, of course, the best way to support us is to subscribe. $19 a month is a subscription for the China Global South Project, $199 a year. That money goes directly to support the work we're doing, creating independent, nonpartisan, agenda-free journalism about what China's doing. Positive and negative. China is a complex actor, so it's not either one. And that's the role that we take in all of this. So go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. We'll give you 1 month for free. If you are a student or a teacher, just email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you a discount code for a half-off subscription. So we would love for you to join us. Guys, thank you so much. We're up at our time. And boy, it was an action-packed week. We'll be back again next week. Geraud is heading off to Europe for some super interesting meetings. So I'm really looking forward to sharing all of what he learns up north with everybody next week. And so we'll be back. So for Geraud, who's going to be in Europe next week, and Cobus, who's going to stay in Johannesburg, and I'm going to stay here in Ho Chi Minh City, we'll be back again next week with another episode of the China in Africa podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.